Greetings, fellow 5e nerds. As we are in the throes of a big new D&D book release, I wanted to take a quick look back at my own 5e collection and consider my faves and not so faves. My ranking is a combination of how useful I found a book over the years, how much I would recommend the book to someone else, and my personal bias for what I find fun in my own games. This list is obviously limited to the books I personally purchased, so if your favorite isn't on here, tell me about it in the comments. All right, let's get to the ranking. First book and bottom of my ranking for books I own is Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus. I do have the alternate cover for this one. I unfortunately was never able to play through a full campaign of this book, and most people actually recommend skipping the first 2/5 of the adventure, which is not a good sign. As you can tell from the rest of this list, adventure books just aren't for me. I like running homebrew worlds that my friends and I create or running specific settings without sticking to a specific adventure. And even for people that like pre-written adventure books, I couldn't recommend this adventure to a lot of people unless you specifically want a Mad Max ride through hell, which can be pretty cool. I don't want to say that this is a bad book, but it is the book that I most regret being on my shelf. Number 13 is the Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica. I like the information presented in this book. I think Ravnica is a cool setting. I think there are interesting little player options to make a faction of a party in this setting. However, I have to admit, I've never actually gotten to play in the Ravnica setting. My game store even offered it as an introduction for Magic players to get into D&D, and nobody took us up on it. It's Again, I want to like the setting, but I've just never had anybody actually take me up on it, which must be a sign. Occasionally, I will use some of the very nice monster stat blocks in the back of the book. So, Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica still gets some points there, but overall, not a book that I've gotten a lot of use out of. I could have avoided buying this one. Number 12, Eberron Rising from the Last War. I have the alternate cover for this one. I think this is a good book, and it's a really good example of a fully fleshed out D&D setting, but kind of like Ravnica, I've never fully played in the setting. I have a lot of players who want to play a Warforged, so points there. I've wanted to use some of the stat blocks in the back of this book, but then I look back at them and it's like, it doesn't really fit. It's got to be an Eberron. And I don't really regret buying this book at all. I think on my path of kind of creating my own settings, this is a good one to refer back to just to see how it's done. Uh, but I have not gotten to play an Eberron, and at this point, I don't think it's going to happen. Fizban's Treasury of Dragons, number 11. This is a nice book with good info on dragons, and as the name suggests, not much else. It has some really nice roll tables in here. I like coming up with treasures based on the hordes presented in this book, especially. There are a few maps that I'll use on Roll20. Overall, this is a good reference that I'll use once or twice in a campaign when I have dragons show up, but not more, which is why it's so low on this list. Everything else I'm going to look at more than I refer to Fizbans. Number 10 is the original Monster Manual. This book has good stat blocks, but I've easily replaced those by using monster cards when I'm not playing on Roll20. The only reason to look back at this book is for monster descriptions, which are honestly pretty weak in this first edition of a monster book. Uh, it was a good resource that I used a ton at the start of my 5e career, but I rarely look back at it now. So that's why this book is so low. Number 9 is Volo's Guide to Monsters, and at this point, I'm proud to have all these books on my shelf. These are books that I regularly look back to. Uh, Far better monster descriptions and lore in this one, and I still have a lot of players and myself who will use the monstrous PC races in this book. I think Volo's Guide is very well laid out and has a wonderful selection of monsters. I have Mordenkainen's higher on this list only because I like the monsters in that book more than the ones in Volos. I will still use the ones in Volos a lot and a lot more than the ones in the monster manual, um, but not some of my personal favorites coming out of this book. Number 8 is the Dungeon Master's Guide. I have not been the biggest fan of the DMG. It was not my first recommendation to Dungeon Masters when I was working at the game store. However, now I do find myself referring back to it frequently. There are a lot of magic items in this book that I don't use the book for because I use magic item cards, but there's still a lot of good roll tables, a lot of good rules and rulings to look back to, a lot of guides for how to create your own setting, especially on the micro level of like, how do you create a little town? Here's the little tavern that's in the town. Uh, there's still good stuff in this book, and I can still recommend it to people now. Number 7 is the Player's Handbook. It might be odd for some people to see this book this low on the list when it is the essential book for playing 5e. However, I can't get past the bad layout of this book. It's so hard to go back into and find the rules that you need. Um, Obviously, I got a ton of use out of this one, and I still check in on it during a campaign, even when most of my resources are online. I like to have a player's handbook handy where I can look up the price of staying in an inn, or even just, ooh, what are they going to get on their next level up? The player's handbook is essential for playing 5e, but at this point, I couldn't recommend anyone buy it because there's a new player handbook coming out. But respect to this one, I appreciate having it on my shelf, and it'll be something that I refer back to for years to come. Number 6 is Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes. This book has some great monster lore and player options provided. The monsters in this book are just fantastic. You've got your demon lords and your archdevils, plus lots of other great monsters that I use a ton of. Uh, it's only this low on the list because of another book that we'll see coming up very high. But I got a ton of use out of this. I think this is the book that I've gone through with a highlighter and a pen the most, trying to really get into what these monsters do and highlight how I'm going to use them in an encounter. This is a great resource, and because it's considered outdated now by Wizard standards, if you can find it for sale somewhere, I would recommend buying it. Number 5 is Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. This is an absolutely phenomenal book for settings, and I say settings because there's so many different places you can use for so many different campaigns in this book. I love the rules for stress and fear. There are some great monsters. Overall, the book has a wonderful layout. And there's even a few good character options in there with some races and the dark gifts. I really recommend this book to anyone looking to add the spice of horror to their D&D campaign. Even if you're not going to use a Ravenloft setting, there's a lot of good stuff in here. Number 4 is Xanathar's Guide to Everything. This is an incredible reference. I use it for literally every campaign that I'm running, even if it's just for the random name tables in the back of the book. There are obviously great player options in this book as far as subclasses go. I love the rules for tools and the backstories. Xanathar's Guide was a huge step up in 5e's game, and I'm glad that I have it on my shelf. And along with that, we're going to have the Other Everything book with pick number 3, Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. This is a small book. That's what I hear a lot of naysayers about this book say about it, but there is a surprising amount of good info in it that I still use for all of my games. I like group patrons. I like the magical environments. I like sidekicks. There's a lot of great player options that have now been ported over to the new player handbook, and a lot of great subclasses. There's a lot of great spells. The feats in here are wonderful. It's just all around a wonderful little book, even if it's a little small. I use it in every game, and I'm glad that I have the alternate art copy. It's awesome. My number 2 pick is Mordenkainen Presents Monsters of the Multiverse. This is a collection of monsters from the Monsters Manual, Volos, and Mordenkainen's, which is why those books are lower now, because I find myself using the redone and in some cases rebalanced versions of the monsters that we find in Monsters of the Multiverse. This also includes almost all of the player race options um, that I find all my players using on Roll20 games anyway when I have this book available. So this gets way high up on the list because it is by far my most used resource in games. If I were recommending someone getting into 5e right now, the two books that I think they would need to start with would be the 2024 Player's Handbook and this book. And my number one pick for my absolute personal favorite 5th edition D&D book is Mythic Odysseys of Theros. I think that this book has the perfect layout as far as the guide between what it gives to players, what it gives to DMs, and then going into the monster lore. I think it has a perfect sampling of gods and a great example of world design. I think this is a wonderful setting to play in, and it's one that I've gotten to play in many times in both professional and personal games. It's so easy to get new players and old players in on the sword and sorcery action of this one. The monsters are wonderful. I love playing with piety. I love giving my player characters supernatural gifts. It's just a wonderful setting book with so much more to give, and it has kept on giving for my whole career with it on my shelf. And yes, I have the alternate cover, and I even have the playmat to roll my dice on with it. And that is going to wrap up my personal ranking of the books that I own. Which ones would you bump up higher? Which ones would you knock down lower? And which ones do you have in your collection that I missed out on? Tell me in the comments, please. And thank you so much for watching this. I hope you have a Nat 20 day. Bye bye.